Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining me on the podcast is Rob Larity for our weekly chat on geopolitics and markets. For the first time in really months, Rob and I get a little bit more introspective on this podcast. There has been so much going on in the world, and it has felt like every week we're just trying to cover all the things that are happening. And I think just because of the way things have worked out, both Rob and I got a chance to step back. In this conversation, we talk about things like uncertainty and risk and fear and ideology and what those things mean within a geopolitical framework. So there's actually probably not a lot of answers in this podcast. There's a lot more questions and playing with ideas that we usually talk about. Some of you listeners love when we do these kinds of more, introspective, thoughtful episodes. Some of you wish it was just the brass tacks of geopolitics, but you can't really do the brass tacks if you don't take a step back every once in a while and take stock. See what I did there? Of how you're thinking about the world and organizing your mental hygiene in particular ways. So I hope you enjoy Rob and I basically trying to get the cobwebs out of our mind and exploring where the world is going with all the changes that we've seen recently, and how to contextualize that within the context of how to contextualize that within the fact that we are an investment firm and that we're trying to figure out where are the good stories along with all the bad stories that you're getting fed all the time. So if you want to email me, jacob@cognitive.investments. I'm happy to take your questions about our wealth management services. If you would like us to manage capital for you, if you want to find out about our research and consulting and advisory services, happy to talk to you about that. Also just happy to correspond with you in general. I've received a lot of emails from listeners in recent weeks, and it's been very gratifying to know that you're all out there and that we're building this community that is interested in these things. Can't tell you the lift that it gives me emotionally when I get those sorts of notes. So thank you for all that. If you haven't left a rating or a review of the podcast and you're a new listener, please consider doing so. It takes 2 seconds of your time, really helps us in the grand scheme of things keep this podcast free and churning. So take care of each other, hug the people you love. Cheers, and see you out there. All right, listeners, you can't see me. There's a beautiful mountain behind my head, but when I turn my laptop that way, it looks like just sort of a white sheet of light. Rob, I also want you to know, so, you were taking me to task last week on the podcast for not knowing that Paul Tudor Jones is from New Orleans. Turns out he is not from New Orleans. He is from Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you to the podcast listener who wrote in to tell me that so that I can lord it over you. You're just another carpetbagger who thinks all Southerners are exactly the same. Apologize for yourself. Nice to see you.
Aren't they 1 hour drive away from each other? I don't even know. It's very close.
Oh, he's doubling down. We should cancel this man, but we're too polite in the South to cancel anyone. I also just want you to know, I just had one of the more ignominious moments of my life. So I was cooking earlier this week, and I sliced my thumb pretty good, not on my dominant hand, on my other hand. Although you don't realize how much you use your thumb on your non-dominant hand until you can't use it. Anyway, to shower before I came on this podcast, that I looked presentable, I had to put what basically amounted to a finger condom on my thumb so that I could shower myself and not get this wound wet. So I'm feeling great about myself right now. How are you doing, Rob?
By comparison with that, pretty good. Pretty good indeed.
Pretty good indeed, like a true Northerner. He didn't know any of what was about to happen there, listeners, and I got him completely off guard. We're going to talk about two things today. We're going to talk about uncertainty and ideology. Maybe by the end of the podcast, we'll come up with our own personal uncertainty ideology principle and put our names in the history books with, I was about to say Heidegger, but that's wrong. It's Heisenberg. So let's maybe start with uncertainty. And I'm going to give you the floor for a second, Rob, to just repeat some of the things you said to me as we were prepping for the podcast about the two wars that are happening in the world and what that means about attention and uncertainty, and we'll riff about it from there.
So I'm going to try to explore some ideas here and connect some things that people are probably reading in the news and maybe not putting together. So now we have two wars going on simultaneously, which is a lot. And obviously they're very important in and of themselves and in their own different ways. But I want to step back for a moment and just think about what does this mean as far as investments and finance? So one of the things that we talk about a lot here is about attention and how information is no longer really an advantage. That attention and where you pay attention is where, the alpha is generated in the parlance of finance. And attention flows like water. I like to think of it in this way. Think of it like a river. And now we have two big channels that are being cut, diverting a lot of attention away from your day-to-day. And that's really, it's really important, because not only does it just increase people's mental load, because now you can't help but pay attention to everything going on. And there's a lot less that gets done when there's this much happening all the time. I mean, I don't know, how many podcasts have we published in the last 2 weeks? I haven't even been able to listen to all of them, and it's our own damn podcast. So the amount of mental capacity strain is rising.
I guess so. Although, I mean, to be fair, like, that's a window into what the actual mental capacity strain for keeping track of the world geopolitically looks like. It's just like, usually we don't turn on the microphones for every single conversation. It just so happens we have a conflict that people are interested in, that there's a real dearth of information out there about. And one of the ways I'm coping with the mental load is sharing the conversations I'm having behind the scenes with everybody else. But I take your point. Like, it has definitely been an overwhelming amount of information. And the irony there too, I don't know if you saw that Wired article speculating about why Israel's defense forces and intelligence failed with regard to Hamas's attack. But part of it was they had too much information. Like, it was just a completely overwhelming, like, they have cameras on everything. They have places, and you would think that means they know exactly what's going on in the Gaza Strip, but it was actually flipped. They probably didn't have enough people to sort through all the different signals, and they couldn't tell what was a real threat from what was not a threat. And I know we think of this as a problem that's recent. It goes back decades. I mean, go read The Looming Tower. For 9/11, the U.S. intelligence agencies had the information. Technically, 3 different agencies had the puzzle pieces that they needed to put it together to know it, but getting the right information to the right people with the right context and labeled with the right level of importance, really, really difficult.
Yeah, attention and information, right? So it's all about where you're paying that attention and how do you kind of take that information and digest it and figure out what to focus on. But the other element of this is when you have a lot of information in general, but especially in this context where this is a very volatile situation in lots of parts of the globe, the uncertainty increases. So getting to our uncertainty principle, which I think is really important and something worth focusing on very explicitly if you're not, because uncertainty is a cost. Uncertainty is risk. And, when we started Cognitive and we really made an effort a few years ago to build out a really good geopolitical capacity, I remember having this conversation with you and saying like, hey, I really think that we're entering this volatility cycle and that really understanding geopolitics is going to be so important and we want to make that a key part of what we do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can see that that's playing out now, and that uncertainty, that volatility is showing up across all sorts of markets. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make is it's really worth thinking about that in a systematic way when you're thinking about your own portfolio, your own business, whatever it is that you're doing, because these costs are rising and they're often difficult to see. So just to give some example around that, right? Look at a few different areas of the economy right now. We have a Florida insurance market that is essentially collapsing because the uncertainty of, the weather events in Florida and the cost to settle claims in Florida and also in Louisiana to a different extent has reached the point where they need to earn more to be compensated for it, and they can't raise the prices to compensate. So they're just failing, right? Another example from the last week that I saw, there was a piece in FreightWaves about shippers. So right now, the spot price of shipping something via truck has collapsed, with the inventory cycle and those sorts of things that we've talked about. But the piece in FreightWaves was interesting because it pointed out that shippers who usually follow the spot rates down and take advantage of that, are locking in capacity. They're locking in contract rates at much higher prices than they ordinarily would relative to the spot price, because they're scared of not getting the capacity when they need it. They're scared of the uncertainty that something's going to happen, that they're not going to be able to get trucking capacity when they want it. So you see all of these different examples. And last week, to go purely into financial markets, we talked about risk premiums on U.S. Treasury bonds. It's another example. What is a risk premium or a term premium? It's the cost of uncertainty. It's the cost of risk. And if you go back to 1936 and Keynes's economic theory, the foundational book of economics, when he talks about risk, he talks about uncertainty. That investing is all about the cost of that uncertainty and overcoming that uncertainty, and how much are you getting compensated for that uncertainty. And that was an uncertain time, to say the least, 1936. I think the Spanish Civil War was just beginning as that book went to press. But we're seeing that more and more today. And as more of this crazy stuff happens and there's more uncertainty being injected into the world, I think listeners and clients, and certainly we've been speaking about this with our clients a lot, you have to really think about, are you protected against rising uncertainty? Do you have fragility in your own personal portfolio, in your own business? You don't want to be the equivalent of the Miami homeowner who has been effectively short uncertainty pricing for a very long time, and now you're in trouble. So that's sort of a big theme that I'm thinking about, and that I believe will be with us for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I think it extends beyond just portfolios and businesses. I think it also involves personal security. Speaking to somebody who, like, within his immediate family generations had to flee, one continent to go to another just to escape exactly the uncertainty that you're talking about. But I have two questions to throw back at you. The first is, I think one of the things that is happening right now is that people are afraid. And as you said, the rivers of attention that are going towards the war are making people emotional, are making people fearful. They look at their politics, they're even more fearful because they don't feel like anybody's competent or managing things in a competent way, I should say. What I want to ask is, what's the relationship between fear and uncertainty? Because if you listen to the Warren Buffett truisms, when people are afraid, that's actually the time to be investing. But it seems to me that maybe fear and uncertainty aren't the same thing, or are they the same thing? Or how would you sort of splice that? Because like I said, I feel like the Warren Buffett truism is, well, when everybody else is uncertain and afraid, now is the time that you should actually be deploying capital. But I think that's not exactly what you're saying.
Warren Buffett is a really good example, because his lifetime has corresponded almost exactly with the other side of the volatility cycle. So Warren first earned his stripes as an equity analyst, in the late 1930s under Ben Graham. And, really it was after the war that he started reaching a position where he was managing money independently, and he rose to prominence in the early 1950s. So if you were to draw a line from the late 1930s or mid 40s from the war, basically, until 2000, when arguably, Warren had peak fame. I mean, who knows what peak fame is for Warren, but, from there to here, it's been a pretty straight line up for him. But what I'm trying to say is, that truism was true during that period. That was a volatility down cycle, a secular volatility down cycle. Every time something went wrong or it seemed like there was some crisis, it always paid to go step in and buy. Like, I remember very vividly being there in 2007. When was the Turkish coup? It was 2007, right?
Which one?
There was one that people were talking about a lot at the time. There was a coup attempt, I thought.
You mean like the failed coup attempt? That was 2016.
Okay. There was something in 2007 in Turkey. But anyway, my point being that we don't even remember it now. And I remember so vividly at the time, markets were down significantly. People were saying, oh, this is the end of the emerging market, bull market. I mean, if you were to look back now, it's probably barely a blip on the chart. But that was the kind of thing that happened all the time. So I think Warren's statement is correct, but it's also a function of the times. Because when volatility begets more volatility, then oftentimes it doesn't pay to just blindly go in a way that maybe it did 20 years ago. But to answer your question about fear and uncertainty, I think those two things are deeply linked because we're always afraid of the unknown. And that's why investors get paid. That's why you earn a return on your investment, because you're getting paid for your fear. You're getting paid for bridging the gap between today and some uncertain tomorrow, some fearful tomorrow. Because, if everyone was just uncertain about how good it would be, there would be no return to be had. But there's fear that things could be bad, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And by the way, you're right. I was looking this up while you were talking. There was apparently a memorandum published by the Turkish general staff around elections in 2007, which suggested the military might intervene to defend the country's secular system. So there was some kind of coup thingy happening in Turkey around that time. So you got that correct. But the second question I wanted to throw back at you was, is certainty even possible? I mean, like one of the exercises I've done, think about the period from 1990 to, let's call it, the pandemic. So 1990 to 2020. We think of that as a really great time, the internet and iPhones and the unipolar moment. But if you actually look closely, well, we had 9/11 and the rise of Islamist fundamentalism. We had Russia invading Georgia in 2008. We had the rise of Xi Jinping and the sort of false promise of China. We had the 2008 financial crisis. You start looking through what happened over this really optimistic, certain time. Probably, and I didn't even mention the dot-com bubble and all the other things that are in there. Which goes, our firm is called Cognitive Investment. Some of this is that maybe people are feeling the fear and uncertainty now, even though it was there before. But the question I'm groping for is, to what degree is certainty even possible? That almost seems like a completely false notion. You're never going to be certain about anything. I guess markets delude themselves into thinking they can be certain about things. But why do you think they're more uncertain now than they were in 2011, when the Arab Spring kicks off and you've got the Syrian civil war and a nuclear meltdown in Japan? Like that, like you start to throw those things together. Those are rivers of attention running towards really bad things.
Yeah, that's valid. But it's all relative, right? Like last week we talked about the term premiums and treasuries and pointed out how everyone's looking at the widening spreads and saying, oh my God, everyone is panicking because look at how these term premiums have now gone positive. And yet if you look at some longer term history, like we have not yet to even begun to realize what fear and uncertainty is. And I don't know. I mean, you could argue that there was a lot of uncertainty about some of these key moments. Certainly the financial crisis, 9/11, those are significant events, and we don't mean to downplay that. But I think it's fair to say that they took place against a background of compressing volatility, which means like they were counter-trend events. They weren't the sort of events that then lead to other more volatile, crazy events. And I think that's fundamentally the difference between now and then, where I really liked Marco's phrase that he used, the score settling, where people are taking advantage of the growing sort of fog of war and attention flows to settle scores. And you're seeing this all over the place. That's not something that I think really happened even in the worst periods of other volatile or scary events. That's a big difference, I think.
Yeah, I do think there is something also in the volatility of U.S. domestic politics that reflects itself there. Because even though we are in this multipolar world, we've talked about it, ad nauseum on the podcast, the United States is still the most powerful country in the world. And in some ways, it's the country that most countries look up to in the world. And if you look at our own domestic politics, it's an absolute dumpster fire. We have lost what Shelby Foote says was our greatest gift, which was the gift for compromise. We can't even have a Speaker of the House. And the speakers of the House that we are considering think that the last election wasn't completely legitimate. And I'm not here to weigh in on that one way or another. It is just to say that if you are a country in the world that wants to settle a score, you're no longer afraid of the big bad United States taking you to the UN Security Council necessarily, or NATO coming down on you, or some external actor coming in to enforce international laws and norms. It's one of the reasons I've always been skeptical about arguments that bring in international law, because I think even in the heyday of unipolarity, international law was a fairly weak concept in general, and not one that had a lot of strength behind it. But when people are talking about war crimes and Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza and Azerbaijan and Armenia, sure, call them war crimes. You want to debate the definition of genocide? That's fine. But when war happens, there are no rules. We make rules, the victors make the rules after the fact. But the thing that is so heinous and terrible about war is that there are no rules. And we try to put guardrails around them. We try to give ourselves the illusion of certainty, as you say, that, civilians can't be hurt, or this, that, or the other thing can't be hurt. But the reality of war is that nobody listens to that stuff that is actually fighting the conflict. Their only goal is to actually win. And it is a very, very cozy, comfortable external position to look at something and say, oh, well, this breaks some law code or something. But anyway, the point I'm just getting at is that I think there has been this shift towards, well, the United States is not charging into Afghanistan again. It's not charging into Iraq again. It's actually thinking America first. And even Biden is thinking about making things great in America again. So I do think there's a reflection that the world is in some ways giving us the mirror image of some of the chaos within the United States. And that's why I often tell audiences when I speak to them, the number one chaos agent, the number one source of uncertainty in global geopolitics right now is the United States. There's no uncertainty about what China wants or what China's going to do. There's no uncertainty about a lot of different things that are happening in this country. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the future of American politics looks like. And I think that's one of the reasons you get so much uncertainty in the world, but also maybe this fear index, because this thing that was a lodestar is no longer a lodestar.
One of the things that we've talked about in the past, specifically in the context of politics, and usually less developed countries where there's political volatility and extremism and sort of revolutions, and oftentimes we've talked about how it's not, you don't get revolutions when there's too much control or too much clamping down and people revolt. What happens is when you have revolutions, when the window appears to be open for anything to happen, and you sort of have this moment of defining what is the future going to look like. So I've been reading a very good history of the English Civil War in the last few weeks. And one of the things that's so striking about that period is you have, you could apply the same thing to the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, all sorts of examples. But in this case, where you have sort of a long established order, that all of a sudden, oh my God, like the emperor has no clothes. Like people were literally going into the abandoned Whitehall Palace and sitting in King Charles's chair and saying, oh my God, like he's just a guy. And if you look at how things spiral, and you have the extremist parliamentarians and then the even more extremist levelers and just program after program and fighting, and then the war is going on and just the physical nightmare of the war and the lack of food and death and disease and physical deprivation, how that feeds into even more sort of extreme thinking and more sort of desire to seize the mantle and impose your thoughts on what the new way should be, because now it's an open game. that's a really striking pattern that I think you see a lot throughout history, and I just wonder if that's happening to some extent on the global stage now. Like you mentioned, the U.S. as chaos agent. Like the U.S. is, in some ways almost like the King Charles, withdrawing its controlling or guiding hand over much of the system, and now it's sort of an open game to an extent, like it wasn't 20 years ago or farther.
Yeah, that's a good point. By the way, for those of you who are playing our little cognitive dissonance podcast drinking game, you can take your drink now that Rob mentioned the English Civil War. You got through 23 minutes before your first English Civil War mentioned, Rob, so that's good. But I think there's also something here about the law of unintended consequences, and getting back to the uncertainty question about governments and leaders or investors too purchasing certainty now because, as you said, they're afraid and there are all these uncertainties around them, but that's setting up really deleterious consequences down the road. So I'm right now reading Helen Thompson's book Disorder. Helen's going to come on the podcast next week, so I've been getting sharp on some of her writings, and I'm in chapter 2 or 3 right now, and she's giving this sort of broad history, geopolitical history of the world of the past 100 years to situate us where we're going so far, and it's been very good. And she's been talking about and spending a lot of time on the 1956 Suez Crisis, which, if you don't know about this was Israel and Britain and France decide to invade Egypt, basically to keep the Suez Canal open to shipping. And the United States comes in and says, absolutely not. It's the Eisenhower administration. They say, you can't do this. And Britain, we're going to cut off your access to dollars if you do this. And Israel and France, absolutely not. And they all have to withdraw. It's kind of hard to imagine that in sort of the current ideological structure of the world right now. We'll get to ideology in a bit. But she talks about the unintended consequences of that, because the U.S. policy at the time was it didn't want to get involved in the Middle East, and the U.S. was still an energy superpower. It hadn't gotten to the point in the 60s where oil production was declining. So the issue of oil and keeping the Suez open was what was really crucial to Western Europe. Britain and France, they were getting something like, I forget the exact figure she said, I think it was something like 70% of their oil was getting shipped through the Suez eventually from the Persian Gulf. And the only structure, or the only military structure that was in place to keep the oil flowing was the remnants of Britain's empire. Britain still controlled all the protectorates in the Gulf. They still had their relationships in Iran and things like that. The United States didn't want to enter. So they slap Britain and France and Israel on the wrist, get them to withdraw in the hopes that they can have an alignment with Egypt down the road. But they still expect Britain to be the security guarantor for Gulf oil, because they're not willing to go in with U.S. troops and U.S. military force in and of itself. And it also builds back on, a couple years before that, the United States with Britain helping overthrow a democratically elected president in Iran in 1953 who was going to nationalize, I believe it's the Anglo-American, I forget the exact name of the company, but they were going to nationalize the oil company that the British had set up in Iran, and they were going to have it for the Iranian state itself. And you can draw a direct line from 1953 to the Iranian Revolution to the Israel-Hamas war right now, and whether Hezbollah is going to enter the fold, like all deeply connected. And my point there is just to go back is, the Eisenhower administration bought certainty then in 1956, thinking, okay, if we can just put Humpty Dumpty back together here, everything will go back to normal and our allies will listen to us and the oil will continue to flow. And you zoom it out, we're still paying for the short-sightedness of the Suez conflict. And I think there was a lot of short-term thinking going on here in general, which is maybe a nice little segue to, because I think it's good. We've been talking a lot sort of abstractly about these things, but you mentioned this before, and it was something I wanted to talk about on the podcast anyway. But this news this week that the United States and Venezuela have finally agreed to some kind of normalization is not the right word, but they're going to deal with each other a little bit more pragmatically. So Venezuela is going to let opposition candidates or something like that run for election. Of course, they're not going to win, but there's going to be more of a nod to democratic elections. And in return, some U.S. oil sanctions on Venezuela are going to go by the wayside. And I bring it up in this context because I was thinking about it in relation to Suez, because that feels like buying short-term certainty without any kind of strategic plan. I'd be the first person to sit here and tell you it makes all the sense in the world for the United States to normalize relations with Venezuela, with Cuba as well. It does not make sense to do it as a knee-jerk reaction to a potential regional war in the Middle East that might not even happen in the first place. And it's this sort of desperation where, oh my God, oil just spiked to 90 a barrel. We've been talking to the Venezuelans for a while. We got to get this deal out there so that we can push the price of oil back down. Congratulations, you pushed the price of Brent crude from 90 to 87. What are you going to do next? So Venezuela's just going to remain what it is. It seems like there's almost no plan, but there is this knee-jerk grasp for, okay, we can have some short-term certainty here. I wonder what the long-term consequences of doing it in that way, in that sort of haphazard way, is going to have, what kind of impact that's going to have on oil markets, on U.S. Venezuela relations, on U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, sort of all those things working together.
I guess just in terms of short-termism in American politics or any kind of democratic politics, do you think, if we weren't so short-term oriented, we probably, do you think we would still be in a unipolar kind of moment, is what I mean? If the United States made concerted efforts to ensure that we retained a very aggressive and healthy international presence, or that we would act as if it were 1995 and not 2018. Is it just a matter of short-termism and not seeing that that's in our benefit, or is there something else more fundamental at work there? If that question, if I'm saying that clearly.
It does, and it actually kind of leads into the ideology bit. But this is where the difference between policy and politics comes to the forefront. George Friedman used to tell me all the time that policy is what people want to happen, and politics is what actually does happen. Now, I think George shortchanged policy a little bit too much. If you have good policy, you can paper over a lot of your constraints. You can even change some of your constraints into neutrals or maybe even to strengths. And if you have bad policy, you can also spoil a fairly good situation. The fall of the British Empire was probably inevitable, but they sure did speed it along with a lot of bad policy errors. So I don't think policy is insignificant, maybe as some other geopolitical thinkers do, but it certainly plays a role. And here the United States, look, I think we were headed towards a multipolar world no matter what. And that's not a statement about U.S. power. I think U.S. power has stayed relatively the same, maybe even increased. It's a relative comparison versus countries like China or Turkey or Brazil. And that's the way globalization was supposed to work. A rising tide was supposed to lift all boats. The United States just had this idea that, once China's economy gets better, it's also going to turn into a liberal democracy too, and we function better with liberal democracies. And that, of course, was never going to work. So I don't think the United States was ever going to exist in a world where it was going to keep all of these other countries down. How the United States responded to attacks on itself, whether it was the jihadist attacks in 2001, whether it was Russia's invasion of Georgia, which was really about disproving U.S. security guarantees in Eastern Europe, whether it was about Xi Jinping and the rise of self-reliance in China and places like this. The United States' response to that was not, okay, everybody that still wants to be in the club, we're going to double down on them even more so. And yes, maybe the United States economy will not be as perfect as it could have been, but as long as we keep a rules-based international order with most of the world playing by those rules, that rising tide will lift all the boats that want to play, and maybe eventually there's a confrontation down the road with anybody who doesn't want to play. That's not what the United States did. The United States did what it has done over and over and over again in its history, which was to say, America first. Woodrow Wilson in 1916 said America first when he was campaigning in the context of World War I going everywhere, and he wanted to tell the electorate, no, don't worry, we're not getting involved in foreign wars. George Washington said, don't get involved in foreign wars. It's encoded within the genetics of the republic. And that's the cycle that we're in right now. We are in the America first cycle. So do I think that around the edges from a policy perspective, the United States could have strengthened a more unified coalition of powers against revisionist powers? Absolutely. But, I also think that if I was a magician and I could wave a magic wand and produce a pony, and it's not realistic. It's not in the DNA of the United States and in the political experience in general. And I'd also just say it's we talk about democratic governments a lot. A lot of this has nothing to do with democracy. Yes, democratic governments select new presidents, but Joe Biden didn't need to go to Congress to decide this about Venezuela. Joe Biden didn't need to go to Congress to approve his trip to Israel amidst a war. the U.S. executive has a lot of power over foreign policy, and even more power since the advent of nuclear weapons. And Congress has given up whatever constraint or whatever ability it had to compose constraints on the U.S. executive. So we change, the heads of government more often than most other countries. But when presidents are in power, they can do things like Donald Trump just saying, Iran nuclear deal, poof, gone. He didn't have to go to Congress for that. He just decided to do that one day. So does that answer your question well enough?
It does. I guess one thing I always wonder about is, it's funny because people always, of a certain bent, criticize the United States as a imperial power and that sort of thing. But I guess two things I wonder about. First is, some of the sources of our power and their roots in geography and culture. Would we be able to, in other words, be such a powerful nation and have a more aggressive international stance? So what I mean is, because we're so far away, because we're so insulated from everything else, that's been a great source of fundamental strength. But is that also a reason why it's America first and kind of always has been America first? And is there any resolving that that contradiction? And would we want America to be more aggressive in, do you want an American empire? Is that a good thing for the world? Is unipolarity in that sense a good thing, given maybe I'm just having a dour look on things because of everything happening in the world at the moment, but are we headed in a good direction ultimately? Is it good that there's more balance?
So I'll try to answer that, but I'm going to dance around it for a second, which is empire is another one of these words like genocide or war crimes that a lot of angst about what it actually means and things like that. I would say that the scale of the United States' power has been imperial in the world since the end of World War II. But look at what the United States did in the years immediately after World War II. It had just done battle with Germany and with Japan. And then on the horizon was the threat of the Soviet Union and communism. And what did the United States decide to do? There were voices that didn't want to do this. The United States decided to rebuild Western Germany and Japan, to make them mature economic outposts that could push back against Soviet influence. I'm the other book I'm reading right now in tandem with Helen Thompson's book is a William Manchester biography of Douglas MacArthur, a very complicated man that I have very complicated feelings about. But I'm in the section of the book where he's the supreme commander or whatever they called him in Japan during the occupation after the war. Japan was a U.S. colony during that period. Douglas MacArthur decided everything. He wrote the Constitution, the Japanese economy today. All of it goes back to all the decisions that were made in 1945. The point is, though, that the United States didn't make the same mistake that the French and the British did after World War I. They didn't punish their enemies. They took their enemies and made them part of a U.S. consumer system and said, okay, we'll make our BMWs in Western Germany and we'll make our electronics in Japan, and this is going to be great. And yes, we will lose some technical expertise. Maybe we'll lose some jobs, but we will have these outposts that are aligned with us in general. So there's a way to do this without force. And the ironic thing about the United States is the source of its power has always been the things that weren't planned from the top down. It's the cultural forces that a free society creates, the art and the expression and the wealth that it creates, the technological innovation that it creates in the society. Those are the things that people admire and glam onto. I put on the Knowledge platform this week, I think it was one of the most important things I put on there, and it'll probably get glossed over, the fact that Chinese students have stopped wanting to come to the United States since 2019. It used to be that all the top Chinese students, despite the U.S.-China Cold War and Taiwan and Xi Jinping and the trade war, they all wanted to come to the United States because they thought the best science here, they thought it was the freest space to explore the things that were most interesting to them. Now they don't want to come. Now they want to stay in China, or maybe they want to go to Europe, or they want to go to some other place. That's a big flashing warning sign that the United States, in aggressively pursuing what it thinks is in its interest, is actually killing the thing that made the United States what it was, which was, hey, this is a better way of doing things. Like, yes, we have problems, yes, but in the grand scheme of things, this society creates space for people in a way that most societies don't, and that was the thing that people wanted to emulate. And it's always been a push and pull. This goes back right to George Kennan and the Cold War. George Kennan and his famous Telegram X that nobody actually listened to. We think about containment and Vietnam and in the context of the Cold War. Kennan's whole point was, will you stop worrying about it? The Soviet Union is bereft of anything of any spiritual or cultural value. The United States needs to invest in education and needs to invest in bowling leagues at home. And if everybody joins a bowling league and has a good time, the United States will defeat the Soviet Union in the end. That's all you really need to do. And that is a lesson that we've never taken to heart. Look at the defense budget versus what we spend on education in this country. But now I'm sure that a few listeners are going to remember that email we got a couple weeks ago that we sounded like the progressive caucus within the Democratic Party. I'm sure some of you are going to write in there. I assure you that I would get thrown out of the progressive caucus in the Democratic Party after my first dad joke, which would happen probably in the first 30 seconds of my presence.
And there's this one guy who keeps tweeting just insults at both of us, which I find really funny because he tweets insults for like months. But he's clearly listening to every podcast. Like, he can't get enough of how stupid we are, I guess.
Yeah, he just loves watching the car accident of the train wreck every week, I guess. Fascination of the abomination. But I probably muted him. I've stopped looking at comments and things like that. If you email me, I do respond to emails, and I've gotten some really great emails. Like, if somebody's going to stop and actually send you a thoughtful email, I find there's still like a sense of decorum and respect there, but social media comment. Anyway, we're going off track here. Before we get too far off track, I did want to bring this back to actually a question that a listener had for us, which I thought was really interesting. It might be a good way to talk about also what's going on in the world, because we've been a little bit ethereal here so far in the first 40 minutes of the podcast. I can't believe it's been 40 minutes. Anyway, the question is, does a multipolar world increase the importance of ideology and preferences relative to constraints? And I love this question. And Rob, I'm eager to hear what you think. I'll give you sort of my very short spiel on this, which is there's no easy answer here. There's no black or white or yes or no answer. But in general, if you think of ideology and constraints as a chicken and egg thing, or ideology and policy as a chicken and egg thing, I think that ideology is the chicken, not the egg. So I think ideology is very, very important, but it comes after the fact. It comes to justify things that are imposed by interest. But I do think that interest and constraints and imperative, that's what drives things. And then people put ideology on top of that or use that to justify things in general. So if you're looking around at the world right now, for example, let's maybe just look through a couple different conflicts. The Israel-Gaza war that's happening right now. There's not really ideology there. Like, yes, Hamas has Islamist ideology, and yes, you need to understand that if you want to understand Hamas's worldview and things like that. But this is not a conflict about ideology. It is a conflict about there is land, two different peoples claim the land, they both want it, they can't come to an agreement about how to use it, so they're fighting each other. And that's why, on the anti-Israel side of this, you have Hamas, which is descendant from the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni sort of fundamentalist sect, allying with Hezbollah, a Shiite Arab sect that comes out of the Lebanese civil war, allied with Iran, a non-Arab Shiite country that is really in all of this because of, as if we go back to 1953 and 1979 and all the stuff we talked about earlier, there's no ideological coherence there. It's about a conflict over land and people not being able to come to any sort of agreement. Maybe juxtapose this where a place where ideology maybe is important is in the European Union, where the European Union doesn't really have constraints. What it has is an ideology problem. It doesn't have a narrative that it can tell all of its member states to join forces together. So the constraint there is you have all these different nationalities with different languages, different histories, and they don't want to all cede sovereignty to a centralized power. And the whole problem of the European Union and of Brussels is it has not been able to come up with an ideology, with a story for European states to tell themselves to make them comfortable in giving up that level of sovereignty and that level of control to a centralized body. So in that way, when you're talking about Europe, yes, ideology is really, really important. And listening to Macron and Scholz talking to each other and how France and Germany are thinking about reforms and what that means in the context of things, maybe ideology is a little bit more important there. We could go through some other countries or conflicts if you want, because I think India is another really great example of this, where India's constraint is that it is a completely diverse, very, very hard to govern society of over 1 billion people and languages and religions and all these other things. And what Modi is doing is he's coming in and saying, no, Hindu nationalism will forge a coherent nation out of this. And that's a clear ideological change from the past. Maybe it will fail, maybe it won't, but he is trying to get over that constraint with a top-down ideology that seems to have some purchase inside of the Indian electorate itself. So there's this back and forth relationship with ideology and constraints. I will never say that one is always more important than the other, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm a geopolitical analyst. I will put 80% of the weight on the geopolitics, and there are absolutely times where ideology will make things better or make things worse or be an accelerant or be a really interesting window into how the interests are working themselves. But it is not, for me, the thing that motivates a lot of the geopolitical developments that we're talking about.
I don't have too much to add on to that other than sort of agreeing that in a multipolar world, that ideology, I don't think it becomes more important, but I think it becomes more splintered or more coherent. And what I mean is, tell me if you think this is BS, but it seems like in a multinational context, so countries defining themselves against each other and against, what is India? What does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to have the Chinese nation? What is that? That often, ideologies are rooted in, defining yourself against the other. And in that sense, they're often kind of fearful ideologies. So, like you mentioned Japan earlier, I think that's a great example. Japan has done extraordinary things over the last 150 years, and it's done them primarily because it was afraid. And that was able, to create that sort of coherence and bring together this very fragmented geographically place around a narrative, a national story of development. And hey, we better, if we don't develop, if we don't get rich, as they used to say, strong economy, strong army. That was the mantra, right? And I think in a multipolar world, you see more opportunities for that because it's more inherently uncertain. And you're trying, if you have more power, you have to define, or more freedom to act, I should say, you have to define how you define yourself in that context.
Yeah, but in that sense, it really is a battleground for the stories that we tell ourselves about the places that we live. So China's a great example. China is led by the Chinese Communist Party. China has not been a quote-unquote communist country for decades. It has been, if you listen to Xi Jinping when he first came to power, he was singing the gospel of supply-side reform. If you put a Ronald Reagan speech next to a Xi Jinping speech in 2014, you'd be amazed at how similar they were. Now, China, the Communist Party, the form of it is communist. They have a Marxist perspective on the world, and the bureaucracy is set up in such a ways with parties and cadres and local governments and all these other things. I don't mean to dismiss the fact that there is an ideological underpinning there. But one of the things that Xi Jinping did was he realized the prosperity boom has probably run out of energy here, and I have to do something to try and inject some ideological legitimacy into the Chinese Communist Party. And he's been throwing a lot of different things at the wall. Anti-corruption for Xi is part of reasserting Chinese Communist Party legitimacy, talking about Taiwan, building up China as a proud player on the international stage that doesn't get bullied by Western powers, also probably part of that as well. Going after tech companies or going after local government, all these other things are part of him trying to imbue the Chinese Communist Party with some legitimacy. But again, ideology there is secondary. He is looking for the narrative that allows him to continue to rule and to continue to have power. The problem is that China has all these constraints that it's beginning to overcome. So the way that the Chinese Communist Party is expressing ideology, the stories that it is telling, the narratives that it is pushing about Belt and Road and things like that, it all goes back to the constraints within China itself. I think usually the countries that have the luxury of ideological arguments are usually the ones that are not geopolitically or existentially threatened. They don't have constraints. And this is in some ways why the United States is so much more unpredictable to me than most other countries in the world, because the United States is existentially secure. The United States has no enemies on its borders that threaten it right now. That you can't say that for China. You can't say that for Russia. You can't say that for a Turkey or India. Those national security strategists, if you're a national security strategist in one of those countries, you have to, the job of a national security strategist is to assume the worst. What is the worst case scenario that could possibly happen? It's a lot easier to get to worst case scenarios for Japan than it is for the United States, because who's the power that is going to invade us from across the Atlantic and the Pacific and destroy the power of the Mississippi River and all the geopolitical advantages that we have? So we have the luxury of arguing who should go in what bathroom and what does this mean for freedom and capitalism and et cetera, et cetera. Most countries don't have that luxury. They're doing more basic things like ensuring food security or ensuring energy security. Or lifting people out of poverty that is not really even imaginable in a Western context right now. So in some ways, like ideology is also it preys on, and I guess this is the way to maybe link it to what we were talking about first. Ideology multiplies in times of uncertainty and fear, because all ideology really is, from my perspective, it's you're grasping to try and put a narrative around what's going on around you in the world. So if things do feel uncertain, you are probably more open to an argument that tells you, hey, this is what it means. And if you believe this, like, you now understand like the secrets of the universe, and you can go forward and just vote for this politician or do this particular thing, and suddenly you will have more certainty. You don't actually have certainty, but at least you have the feeling that you know what's going on. You have some agency or control over your environment. That's usually what ideology is giving you. It's sort of a veneer on the front. And I don't know whether globalization and unipolarity was ideological. In some ways, I think it was so effective because it wasn't really. But that there's a debate to be had there, probably.
Well, I guess it was the triumph of the non-ideological, the triumph of the forget about your ideologies, we've got better stuff, and join the globalized system, and you're going to have a nicer car and a nicer home, and you'll have shoes. And is that an ideology?
Everybody agreed that no, it is, because the ideology was globalization and free trade. Like, the communist system collapsed. There was no real challenger to the WTO and the United States vision of the world. And all of these countries that had been held back by the Cold War wanted to get rich. And the way that you got rich was by joining the WTO and joining the EU or joining whatever, signing more free trade agreements. And that was how these countries made money and developed. The thing is, it's that thing about how the seeds of the crisis are sowed in the solutions of the previous crisis. It worked. It worked so well that countries like China looked around and said, okay, we've gotten to a certain amount of wealth. We noticed a few of these rules, though, don't really go in our favor. We'd like to change those rules. And then everybody's like, no, you can't do that. You agreed to play by the old rules, and China doesn't have to play by the old rules anymore because they are wealthier, because they are more powerful, precisely because they bought into the system. And now we're back in the realm of ideology versus the Chinese view of the world and the US view of the world. And what does globalization really mean? And what does it mean to be in the WTO? All those sorts of things.
I guess that's one thing that I wonder about. And I agree with the notion that if you think of the volatility cycle, the secular volatility moves over decades, that they have historically correlated with ideology. So ideology became more and more important as, we headed into the late 1800s and volatility increased, and then obviously into the war in the 20s and, all of that, and then cooled dramatically during the sort of unipolar period. I'm not sure if we're seeing a resurgence of that yet, but I think that would be one thing that I would be looking for is, and this gets to our EU bullish thesis a little bit, is like, where are the religions? Where are the quasi-religious ideologies of the ways of people use to make sense of the world? I don't think they're emerging quite yet, and maybe we're a little too early in the volatility cycle and things have to get more bad first. But I would expect to see that really increase, almost a resurgence in, I use the word quasi-religious, but systems of thought that are ideological, and put meaning around everything.
Yeah, I think you're right that we're early stage here. So we're so early stage that the overwhelming ism that people talk about today is populism. And populism doesn't actually mean anything. Populism just means in whatever domestic context that you're in, you give people something so that they are more comfortable or to assuage their fears or things like that. But there's no operating principle. You can see the beginnings of some types of ideologies out there. I've talked about it before. Climate politics, being green in an ideological way, like that has all the sort of hallmarks of an ideology to rule things. Now, it does not have a dominant voice. It doesn't have a majority voice. And again, I'm not talking about whether the aims are good or not, but you can absolutely see how green politics has created ideological problems. Just look at Germany right now. We just published our In Focus piece on Germany for our clients in the last couple of weeks. There was an ideological decision to abandon nuclear power because it was seen as not clean. So like there's something in there. And if you start looking around the world, like it's also hard to decide, like nationalism is not really ideology. Like nationalism and democracy sort of go hand in hand. I think it's too simplistic to say that nationalism is just an ideology. But look at a place like India, where you're combining Hindu nationalism, which is a real turn from how India approached its diversity before. It used to think of its diversity as a strength. Now it's thinking of Hindu majority and self-reliance. And you start to put those things together, okay, maybe you have the nascent sort of steps of an ideology together. Look at what Turkey has been trying to do for a long time here. For as long as Erdogan has been in power, he's been trying to recall Ottoman glory, but also Islam, and bring conservative principles back to the fore. And he is often castigated for his unorthodox monetary policies. So that's him pushing back against the orthodoxy of central banks and things like that. You can see like the little building blocks of things like that in general, but it's not. Mexico actually is also a really, really good example because it hasn't really congealed into an ideology. Mexicans were really, really frustrated with what globalization did to their economy. It didn't bring them some of the benefits that they thought. It brought immense wealth and growth, but it also brought inequality, and that nobody ever really made up for that. At the same time, you had the proliferation of the cartel wars and the failure to get violence under control in Mexico, and you had just rampant corruption everywhere. So that hasn't congealed into an ideology yet. It congealed into the election of AMLO, who was this anti-corrupt populist crusader whose views are very, very strange. The question now is Morena is this now some sort of new state-led, capitalist, self-reliant model that Mexico's part of some broader, if it sounds like I'm being a little bit vague here, it's because my point is just that it is vague. You can see the breadcrumbs of ideologies maybe beginning to come together, but they're really not there. Sort of the narrative is up for grabs in most countries in the world where democracy is happening. And I think one of the reasons that you've seen authoritarian regimes like China or like Russia crack down is because they don't like that it's all up in the air. They want to establish the narrative right now and say, well, this is how Beijing views it, and this is how you better view it as well. So.
And do you think that ideology is necessarily sort of in-group, out-group focused? Like, in other words, if you want to speak of sort of a nationalist ideology in all these different places, and then broader ideologies in a similar sense, so environmentalism, like, do each of those things require an out-group to define yourself against? And not to get too highfalutin here, but what I mean is, like, usually nationalism is about, here's why we're special. Here's why Mexico is, in many ways the chosen land, or Turkey or Japan or whatever it is. And then similarly, like, by definition, you're sort of denigrating those who are not in the chosen group or not in the special culture or ideology, whatever you want to call it. And then the environmentalism thing is like, I find this fascinating, and I know we talk about this with regards to the EU and sort of cohesion and stuff, and it is very nascent, and it is still a minority ideology, so to speak, but it really strikes me as a very powerful one, and also one that has big in-group, out-group elements. Like, if you go here and you see the way that people, one of my little pet theories is that in many ways environmentalism has replaced Catholicism in France, because it has the same elements of like self-flagellation, original sin, like all of these things that people, had cast away, and then they're taking them back on in another form, like, oh, my carbon footprint, bad. But these elements tend to bring people together at the same time. And I guess what I'm asking you is, keeping this rooted in like the world that we're moving toward, should we see more of this because it's a way for people to define who they are versus the other? And if you have sort of the idea of some kind of global system or some kind of, unipolar network that you just plug into and you're off to the races, if that breaks down, do people need this more to define who they are and why it's important in a way that they didn't before?
I want the answer to your question to be no, that you don't need the other, but I think, you ran through some of the examples there. I think history tells us that yes, you absolutely do need the other. And in this sense, the pandemic was a real eye-opener for me, because you would have thought that the rise of a virus that was going to infect everybody, no matter what nationality you were or what your religion was, what who you loved, all that other sort of, all the things that make us human or make us individuals, that was actually going to bring countries together to work against a shared enemy. It didn't. We actually used the pandemic to fight against each other. And you might remember vaccine diplomacy and, all those other things that happened and blaming China, and it's the Wuhan virus. No, but you guys didn't have a good healthcare system. It was this sort of thing. And this is one of the ways in which environmentalism, to me, the reason I think it has some coherence is because the narrative is there. Like, climate change is happening. We are seeing, changes, certainly in different countries that are, temperatures are different. And we can talk about how much is that. I don't want to get into the actual climate change debate of that, because then the crazies will really come out for us. My point is just that there's a kernel of truth in that. So it's something that people can see around the world and hang their hats on. The way it gets ideological, to your point, though, is not, okay, let's work with all stakeholders as a planet to figure out how to protect the planet. It goes, let's demonize natural gas producers, or anybody who uses oil is Satan. Like, when you start to get into that and that exclusionary thing, you're not actually doing anything saving the environment. You're making yourself feel good in times of increased uncertainty and increased risk, because you're doing the right thing, but everybody else is doing the wrong thing. So I think there is something in environmentalism in that it like responds to a real world issue that you might hope could be something that would unite people. I cannot forget Andrei Shensov, who's been on this podcast a few times. I've not been able to raise him in the last 12 months or so. He's a Moscow-based analyst. A couple months before the Russia-Ukraine war, he came on this podcast, and I asked him, hey, it feels like Russia-U.S. tensions are at an all-time low, and it feels like, is this the Cold War again? Do you see any prospect for the United States and Russia and China and all these countries to work together? And without irony, he looked at me and he said, yeah, I think that all of these countries could work together on climate change. Like, climate could be the thing that unites the world against a shared enemy that is not othering other human groups, but is othering this thing that is all attacking us all the same. Of course, like, however many months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So there you go.
Well, this is going in a depressing direction. My God.
Well, yeah, we're normally the optimistic ones. So how do you pull out? So we've talked about rising uncertainty, and we're at a peak of a volatility cycle, and we've talked about some of the pitfalls of. And this actually goes back to your metaphor about waters and currents, ideology being a current for attention, when maybe you should be paying attention to the other fundamental things that are causing the ideological shifts, not the loud statements that are on top of it. But you started this with talking about how to apply this in ways that are important for investment. So how do you apply it? Like, do you have an optimistic takeaway from all this, or did we just knock down your optimism a couple degrees?
No, the optimistic takeaway is a mirror image of the negative one, which is when volatility increases, the possibilities open, and all you have to do is look around. Our two things that we, have a special expertise in is geopolitics and innovation. And those two things go hand in hand. When geopolitics become more important, innovation becomes more important, because just as social volatility increases because, hey, the floor is open, anyone can go sit in King Charles's chair and let's create some new laws or new ideologies and forge the future for ourselves. The same works from a technology standpoint, and often the most extraordinary advances, not to mention that they're often tied with defense and war, but let's just put that aside for a moment. But often the most extraordinary advances take place against that backdrop. And if you look right now, just like that is the thing that is so encouraging and exciting, and that is going to blindside people, is just how quickly and how dramatically technology, innovation, and just change from that bottom-up sense is likely to accelerate during that period, because people are just open to new things. You have more creativity, you have more change, more people thinking about these things. And that sounds very, very ethereal. But if you look at someone like Elon Musk, which we talk about a lot, he's a very volatile character. But that's sort of chaos is often what creates, he's also the guy who was crazy enough to create SpaceX. And that's one of the most extraordinary things that's happening in the world today. Like him or not, like whatever, I don't care. But those two things are tied at the hip is sort of what I'm trying to say. So you can be aware of the geopolitical currents and I mean, a lot of that is by definition negative and scary, but joined to it at the hip is positive change almost by definition.
Yeah, and for me, I'll just piggyback on that and also just say, I talked about this earlier this week on the podcast. I believe it was the beginning of the Turkey episode, and talked about mental hygiene and about choosing very carefully what you consume and also understanding the impact of what you consume on you. So we have more information available to us than any before. And the thing that gets clicks, the thing that sells is there's a war, there's an atrocity, there's a huge storm that shows that the planet is warming and we're all going to die. Like that's what people click on. But the positive stories, you don't really get them in there. And go back and do a mental exercise of, okay, the 1990s, that was supposed to be the great time where everything was great. Go back and look at what actually happened in the 1990s, all the terrible, horrible things that happened in the 1990s. There are plenty of them. There's no shortage of them. It's about what you choose to focus your attention on. So even though the world can seem like it's going to hell, the world always seems like it's going to hell if you flit around looking at the places where things are the worst. The things that don't get the clicks are, as you said, there's this new technology that might let's make it practical. A couple of weeks ago, the WHO approved a new vaccine for malaria that is way more effective than the previous vaccine and that could literally transform life in sub-Saharan Africa. Like those sorts of stories are all out there if you go looking for them. So, for me, the takeaway, I imagine that in the 1890s and in the early 1900s or in the 1930s, that people were thinking with that level of angst. And yes, like terrible things did happen, but you got to the other side of it and we innovated on and we got through the other end. And if there's anything the human species has been able to do, it's been able to get over some of these challenges. And that's still the bucket that I'm in. Now, it also depends, what countries we're talking about. I remember I was in Boston last week talking to a group of Chilean executives. It was actually really good for me from like a psychological level in the midst of the Israel-Gaza war to go into a country or to dive deep into a country and say, this country has everything it needs. Like stop squabbling about all these political things, like just increase your R&D as a percentage of GDP and take advantage of your potential food and energy security. And like you're off to the races. This is a positive story. You could be a leader of the pack. Like those stories are around if you look for them. And in some ways, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the geographies and the sectors that buck the trends here, the ones that are not getting the rivers of attention, but that will be the source of humanity's next triumph. That sounds kind of saccharine, but is that fair?
But the saccharine is the facts, because if you zoom out, the chart of human progress or GDP or however you want to measure it is a hockey stick chart, which is the most extraordinary truth of anything. But you have to find, what is going to be driving the next exponential move in the hockey stick from a technology standpoint or from a geography standpoint. Because some places stagnate within that broader trend and some places accelerate. So,
yeah.
So there's, at the end of the day, I think we're still very optimistic.
All right. Well, on that note then, I got to go meet with some business partners out here. So go have fun, Rob. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See ya.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.